Hello and welcome. This is Mouse Gunner, and in this video I'm going to cover open bolt actions in firearms. This demonstration will build upon concepts I have already discussed in some of my previous videos and dealt with in greater detail in said videos. The open bolt action is quite a bit different than the closed bolt action seen in the examples in all of my previous videos, but as I said earlier, some functionality remains the same or is very similar to functions found in closed bolt systems. The first example I'm going to cover is the Sten Mk II, which is, as far as firearm designs go, about as simple as things get. Outside of homemade slamfire guns, the straight blowback open bolt system more or less just automates the firing process found within said slamfire guns. You'll have to forgive the program I used to make these demonstration videos, as its presentation can be sloppy at times. The particular issue we will have in this video is the fact that all of the examples we will look at have the capability of being fired fully automatic. When being fired automatically, the animations will only start with the trigger pulled so that the animations can cycle one after another seamlessly. Unfortunately, this makes it difficult to show the function of the trigger group and also leads to some inconsistencies with the timing of certain parts. With that being said, let's go ahead and start off by identifying the major parts we're concerned with. The first part is the bolt. We have the sear, which is in direct contact with the bolt, very similar to the way that the sear is in contact with the striker on a striker-fired action. And we have the trigger, which is attached to a trigger bar, which is going to act upon the sear. The main big difference between an open bolt system and the more commonly found closed bolt system is the fact that the bolt is held to the rear before the pull of the trigger, rather than being all the way forward with the face of the bolt up against the chamber. And when the trigger is pulled, the bolt will be driven forward by the releasing tension of the recoil spring. So as we pull the trigger will pivot, which is going to act upon the trigger bar, which is going to push outwards towards the front of the firearm. And as it gets pushed along, it is going to, through this contact point here with the sear, going to push upon the sear. And as the sear gets pushed, it will start to pivot down and away from its contact with the bolt here. And once that contact has been broken, it will be driven forward just like the striker on a striker-fired action. And it will act very similarly to the way the striker and a striker-fired action work. So the bolt itself does not have a firing pin within it. It actually has a fixed firing pin on the very surface of the bolt face. So this little protrusion here is the firing pin. And we can see a little bit more clearly on how it is extended out. But it will not act upon the primer within the base of the cartridge until it brings it into the chamber. So we can see that happening. As the bolt drives forward, it's going to strip the next round and then feed it into the chamber. And once the cartridge is fully seated into the chamber, the full momentum of the bolt will act like a hammer on the anvil of the chamber. And all of that momentum will be focused into that protrusion, the fixed firing pin, onto the primer and the base of the cartridge case. And as the bolt travels to the rear, recoiling under the energy of the expanding gases, pushing the bullet down the barrel, the cartridge case will be extracted and ejected, just like it would be in a closed bolt system. And as we are operating the Sten Mk II in semi-automatic mode, the Sten Mk II does have a select fire feature, which we currently have in the single shot mode. It will travel past the sear, which comes up ready to catch it. So when it is done recoiling and drives forward a bit, it will then be caught by the sear and ready for us to pull the trigger again. The remainder of our focus in this example is going to be on the trigger group itself and how it functions in single shot mode or semi-automatic mode, and how it works in fully automatic mode and what the difference is. So currently we're in the semi-automatic mode, and when we pull the trigger, as we've seen before, the trigger bar is going to act upon the sear until the sear pivots away from its contact point with the bolt. But as the bolt is driven forward, this part of the trigger bar is going to contact the protruding part of the bolt that the sear was previously holding on to. And when it does that, it's going to pop the trigger bar down. And as the sear returns due to its return spring, it will fit so that the trigger bar is underneath this shelf. And no longer is this notch here able to engage the sear. So as long as we have the trigger held in the single shot or semi-automatic mode, the sear will not be tripped again. So as the bolt comes back, the sear will come up ready to catch it. And it's not until we let the trigger out and the trigger resets that we can pull the trigger again and fire once again. So let's take a look at how the selector switch modifies that system. So here's the selector switch, and when we activate it, it's going to push the trigger bar off to one side. And it's when the bolt is dropped by the sear that we have our main big difference. So I've taken an alternative look from the bottom of the firearm, and as the bolt comes forward, the surface that the sear normally holds onto that would normally contact the trigger bar instead goes right past the trigger bar because the trigger bar is being pushed off to one side. It no longer contacts that part of the bolt. And as a result, it is not driven downward, and the sear is not allowed to return. So as long as the trigger is held in, the sear will be held down. And as the bolt is driven to the rear and then comes forward again, it is not going to be caught by the sear and instead would just be driven forward again and continue to do so as long as we held the trigger in. Now, one thing that is important to note with a open bolt fully automatic firearm is that sometimes even when you let go of the trigger, depending on the timing, the bolt will still drop forward and fire one more time. So you always have to be prepared for that. So if we continue to watch the cycling here, as we've let go of the trigger, the bolt was still driving forward and fired off one more round. So if we had let go of the trigger at the very moment the bolt had just passed the sear, it would have still gone forward and fired off another round. And we have to be prepared for that with an open bolt, fully automatic firearm to occur. And with the Sten Mk II, I can very easily demonstrate the reason why you don't see any new production open bolt firearms in the United States. And that's because the U.S. government regulates the sale of fully automatic firearms. Now, that doesn't mean that fully automatic firearms are illegal. It just means that the U.S. government regulates them through the ATF. Now, if we were to activate our selector switch and bring this back into the semi-automatic mode, and let's say we're pretending that we were to remove the selector switch and instead replace it with a pin that would permanently hold the trigger bar in this position. And we were selling this firearm as a semi-automatic only Sten Mk II for the U.S. market. Well, it really isn't all that hard to take this design and modify it for a fully automatic firearm. All you'd have to do is cut down this part of the trigger bar so it no longer would make contact with this part of the bolt. If it doesn't make that contact, the trigger bar isn't driven downward and thus deactivating its contact with the sear. So in that instance, if we held in the trigger, it would continue to hold the sear down, and as long as we held the trigger in, the firearm would continue to fire in fully automatic mode. This is a very easy modification to do. Now, in the past, this is something that you used to be able to do legally. As long as you documented the modified firearm as a fully automatic firearm, once the modifications were made, it was perfectly legal to own and operate one of these firearms. But the ATF was really concerned about people making these modifications illegally and not registering them after the modifications were done. And this is the reason why open bolt firearms are more or less banned in the United States, at least new production ones. The next example we're going to look at is the Uzi. And we're looking at it not because it differs really in overall functionality with that of the Sten, but mostly because I know a lot of people are going to be curious how it works due to its notoriety and would be disappointed if I didn't talk about it. The Uzi is also a straight blowback open bolt action, so it works more or less the same as the Sten gun, and where it mostly differs in how functions occur rather than having different functions. With that being said, let's go ahead and highlight the main components. So we have the bolt here, and if we look inside here, we can see the fixed firing pin on the face of the bolt. And it is the shape of the bolt that is the main innovation of the Uzi. It's a pretty unique idea for the time. Rather than having the bolt be entirely behind wherever you have the magazine, instead, the bolt actually extends around that point, which allows you to have a much more compact design. You don't have to have all of that weight behind, means that the firearm doesn't have to be as long. And that is really, honestly, a ingenious way of working around some of the limitations of a straight blowback operated system. The next part we're going to look at is the sear, which we can see actually has 2 engagement points with the bolt, here and here. And then we have the trigger right here, which is going to act upon the sear. Now, we're going to start off shooting this in semi-automatic mode, and as we pull the trigger through this part in the middle is going to pull down on the sears, which are going to break their contact from the bolt, and just like with the Sten gun, the bolt is going to come forward, grip around from the magazine, and then feed it into the chamber. And we can see, the chamber, how little distance the bolt had to travel to get there. It recoils back, extracts and ejects the cartridge case, and then comes back forward. And because we fired this in semi-automatic mode, the sears are ready to catch it. So let's take a look at the trigger group yet again and focus our attention at that, as this is going to be one of the big differences between the Sten and the Uzi, just this slight difference in mechanism. This time around, as we pull the trigger, we're going to watch what happens with this piece here that the trigger is attached to, and as the trigger pivots, this piece is going to be pulled downwards, and as it's pulled downwards, it's also going to pull the sears downwards, as we've seen before. The thing we have to watch out for is what happens after that. So, after a while, with the trigger continuing to be pulled, this block here is going to break its contact with the sears. We can see here that this is how this block contacts the sear. And once this pivots down enough, we can see it's going to eventually break that contact. And when it does, the sears are going to come up. And in this position, even if we were to let out the trigger, this block cannot come back in because it would just contact these points and stop at that point. And when the bolt comes back, the sear is going to come back up, waiting to catch the bolt and hold it in place until we let the trigger reset, allow the block to fall back in place, and we are ready to fire again. Now let's see what happens when we activate the selector that allows us to switch it into the fully automatic mode. So before, with the selector here and the semi-automatic mode, there was this bar that came across the trigger, this block here in any case, to stop its movement. But now, with this bar out of the way, when we pull the trigger, what's going to happen is this block is never going to break its contact with the sears. So let's go ahead and pull the trigger, and you can see as the action cycles, and we'll go ahead and try and pause it at some point. There we go. This block is not breaking its contact with the sears because we've changed how it pivots. Before, when we had the selector switch activated, and let's go ahead and let this action cycle one more time. With the selector switch active, when we fire this time, we see that this block cannot pivot fully. And because it can't pivot down, it instead is going to pivot backward. And as it pivots backward, it's going to break that contact with the sears. So just by that little bit of change, we've changed that dynamic. And again, with the Sten gun, as we discussed, being able to modify a semi-automatic design, if instead of having a selector switch, we just had a bar that came across here that would change the block so that it would always act like this. All we'd have to do is remove that bar, and with it out of the way, it would then function as the fully automatic mode would function. So let's go ahead and do that again. So with the bar out of the way, now that block can pivot downwards and no longer has to pivot backwards. And as a result, we can modify a semi-automatic only Uzi very easily into a fully automatic one. The next example I'm going to cover is the MG III, which is a variant of the MG42. I suspect that this version is in the program I use because the animations could not keep up with the original MG42's rather high fire rate of about 1,200 rounds per minute. Whereas the post-war MG III, depending on its setup, could have a fire rate as low as 900 rounds per minute, which is still pretty fast, but definitely slower than the original. The MG42 is an example of a short recoil operated open bolt action. It is a common misconception that open bolt guns have to be straight blowback operated, but this is not true. An open bolt gun can utilize any operating system that a closed bolt does, and although straight blowback open bolt actions are seen commonly in submachine guns like the Sten and Uzi we looked at earlier, machine guns like the MG42 are more likely to use a lock breech design or delayed blowback action in order to contend with the higher pressures produced by rifle cartridges. So, for this example, we are going to first take a look at how the bolt functions. When looking at the bolt, it's important to note that it is actually a two-piece part. So we have the bolt head up here, and then the bolt body. Another important thing to note is the fact that the firing pin is not exposed like what it was on the two straight blowback operated firearms that we looked at earlier. You can see the firing pin in there, and the fact that it is not currently exposed. And if we look on the inside here, we can see the firing pin, and we'll note that it is actually attached to the bolt body, not the bolt head. It's on the inside of the bolt head, but actually not part of it. This is an important element of the functionality of the MG42, as well as a number of other lock-breeched open bolt firearms. The fact that the bolt is two separate or even more parts, unlike what we've seen previously where the bolt is just a single piece with a fixed exposed firing pin. If we watch as the bolt comes forward, it's going to strip a round from the belt, much like our previous examples have stripped a round from the magazine. It's going to feed that round down into the chamber. And then we're going to see the locking element of the design. This is a roller lock design, which is going to function somewhat similarly to the way a roller delayed blowback system would work, but the main difference being that this is a lock breech design. And as the bolt head comes forward, we're going to see the rollers, which are here, this piece here, are going to extend outward into this area that's attached to the barrel. And once that has occurred, the bolt has locked in place. And what causes this to happen is just a simple camming action. So if we look in here, we'll see this slope surface here, and we'll see a similar surface on the top edge. And this is going to interact with the top and bottom of the roller. So if we watch closely as the roller comes in, at the moment it contacts that slope surface, it's going to start to roll out until it gets to the point where it is now on a straight edge area. And due to this surface here in the back, that roller is now locked in place. Now, you might have also heard, faintly there, the firing off of the cartridge. Well, what happens with that, if we watch the bolt from above, as the bolt head locks in place, it's going to stop moving forward. It's going to stop its momentum. But as we discussed earlier, the bolt body is a separate piece, so it's going to continue its momentum and drive forward. And as it does so, it's going to expose that firing pin and ignite the primer in the cartridge, and then you have the firing. And you may be wondering, why don't we have an exposed firing pin like what we had in those other two examples we looked at? And the reason for that is because those were straight blowback operated systems that do not have a lock breech system, and we need to allow for that breech to be locked in. We need the bolt and the barrel to be locked together before we fire the cartridge. If there was an exposed firing pin, the second we seated that cartridge in the chamber, it would fire. We need a delay before that happens. We need the rollers to come in and lock. So we want the firing to occur after that has happened. And that is the reason why we don't have an exposed firing pin. And instead, we have this multi-piece bolt that we have. And let's continue on and move on to the unlocking process. So this being a short recoil operated system, the barrel and bolt will travel together for a short distance, which we can see happening right now. And as they travel together, the bolt and barrel will remain locked. As you can see, the roller's still out, and it's still being locked by this edge here on the barrel. But as we move in, there is a slope surface on the receiver, and as the barrel and bolt recoil to the rear, that slope surface is going to cam the rollers in, unlocking the barrel from the bolt and allowing the bolt to travel the rest of the distance to the rear, and then allowing for the extraction and ejection of the spent cartridge case. Let's back things up to the moment that the bolt is driving forward and feeding the cartridge into the chamber. And take a look at the bolt internally so that we can see the firing pin and how it works. So currently, with the rollers in their innermost position, they're holding the firing pin in between them back. So the firing pin is attached to this wedge-shaped piece here, which is prevented from allowing the firing pin to move forward because of the contact with the rollers. But as the bolt moves forward and the rollers move outwards, that blocking of the wedge is no longer occurring. And at this moment, we can allow the momentum of the bolt body to continue forward as the bolt head stops its momentum, and this allows the firing pin to drive forward, striking the primer. So we can see that happen again. There's the firing pin coming in and striking the primer. And as the bolt and barrel recoil backwards, the rollers are going to cam back in, and this is going to force the wedge back. Due to this slope surface here, the wedge is going to be cammed back, which is going to bring the firing pin back into its rear position, and again, unable to contact the primer. And now we're going to focus on the trigger group, and although there is going to be some differences with the other trigger groups we've seen so far, the overall functionality is going to remain the same. So we have the trigger here, we have the sear, which is in contact with the bolt, and as we pull the trigger, it's going to pivot the trigger, which in turn is going to pivot the sear down and away from the contact with the bolt, which is going to let the bolt come forward under the strength of the releasing tension of the recoil spring. Now, a couple differences is the functionality of this metal loop here, and also how the trigger acts upon the sear. So as we pull the trigger is going to pivot upon this point here. There's a pin that goes through the frame of the firearm and through the trigger, and the trigger is going to pivot upon that point. Now there's also another pin here, and as we pull that trigger, that pin is going to be driven upwards. And as that pin is driven upwards, it's going to push on the underside here of this part of the sear, which is going to pivot the sear upon this point where it is pinned through the frame, pivoting this part of the sear down. So we can see that in practice here. As that is getting pushed up on by this pin, the sear is starting to pivot downwards. Now, this metal loop is also important because as we pull the trigger, it's going to pivot this part of the trigger down, which is pinned to this metal loop. And as this metal loop is pulled downwards, it's going to cam along the end of the sear here. And once it cams along enough, it's going to go beyond this surface here on the sear. Once that happens, this spring here is going to force the metal loop forward. Now, the reason it does this is so the sear cannot come back up. This surface here will catch the end of the sear and prevent it from coming up. This is a fully automatic firearm. As long as we keep the trigger pulled, this metal loop will keep the sear held down. As we cycle the action, not a whole lot is going to happen here while we have the trigger held in. The pin is going to keep the sear held downwards by pushing up on this part of the sear, and even at this point, if we were to let go, the sear here would still be held in place by this metal loop. So let's go ahead and take a look at what happens when we let go of the trigger. So as we let go of the trigger, right about this point, we see the metal loop is going to come up and keep the sear held down, even though we have let go of the trigger. But as the bolt comes past here, you see it just kisses the top of the metal loop. But as the bolt comes back, that same part that kissed the top of that metal loop, because of the way that the metal loop is shaped here and the way the bolt was shaped here, before it just kissed the top of the metal loop. But now, because we have it angled up like this and we have a different area here, instead of just kissing it, it's going to contact it and bring it back. This is going to break its contact with the sear, allowing the sear to come back up. And once the bolt comes back forward, the sear is going to catch it. A little bit different in functionality, but overall the same. Once we let out the trigger, the sear is going to come up ready to catch the bolt when it comes around again. The last example we're going to look at is the BAR, which is something of an odd duck, which we're going to cover not only because it uses a gas-operated open bolt action, but it also shows that although the open bolt action is a simple concept, it can be designed to be quite complex if you put your mind to it. And the complexity is such with the BAR that even identifying the main components we're going to be focusing on can be a little bit of a challenge. First, starting off with the bolt. It consists of a lot of parts. So we have this part here, and all of this stuff up here, all the way up to here. This is all part of the bolt. And then the bolt is attached to the piston here. This is a gas-operated system, so it does have a long stroke gas-operated system. And here's the piston, which is directly attached to this part of the bolt, or bolt carrier, perhaps you would call it. Then we have the trigger group down here, with the trigger here. And we have a number of mechanisms going on over here. And then we have the sear here with its contact with the bolt here, or bolt carrier if you want to call it that. And then the bolt itself is an articulated piece consisting of multiple parts that go all the way up to here. As we did with the MG42, we're going to first start off focusing on the functionality of the bolt. And just like with the MG42, this is a lock breech design, so currently the firing pin is not exposed. Instead, it's inside the internal parts of the bolt head. And as we cycle the bolt forward, it's going to strip the next round from the magazine and feed it into the chamber. Now, once the bolt head comes to rest on the barrel, it's going to stop its momentum. But the bolt carrier down here is going to continue forward. And as it does so, it's going to force this articulated part of the bolt, which I'm going to just call the arm, upwards. And as that occurs, this articulated arm is going to fit into a recess in the receiver and butt up against this shoulder right here. And this is what locks the bolt in place. If I currently try to force the bolt head to the rear, this articulated arm would prevent it because of its contact with the shoulder. So as the bolt continues forward, the firing pin is going to be driven into the primer in the base of the cartridge, which is going to ignite the propellant in that cartridge. And then the bolt carrier is going to start to move to the rear. And this is due to the expanding gases diverting into the gas tube here, which is going to force the piston to the rear. And as it does so, it's going to push the bolt carrier back. And as the bolt carrier is pushed back, it's going to start pulling down on the articulated arm. And once the articulated arm is pulled down enough so that it breaks contact with the shoulder and the receiver, the bolt head can start moving backwards. And as it does so, it's going to extract and then eject the spent cartridge case. And once the bolt carrier has traveled back far enough, it's going to be caught by the sear, which we can see about to happen now. The sear is catching the bolt carrier, and the sear, interestingly enough, is attached to the spring-loaded area here, which is going to soften the shock of catching the heavy bolt carrier. Let's now look at how the firing pin functions. And this is where the BAR is somewhat of an odd duck compared to the other open bolt firearms we've looked at, as it functions somewhat like a hammer-fired action in that the bolt itself kind of acts like a hammer striking the firing pin. And we can see that happening as the arm here is articulating upwards. This part of the bolt is coming forward. And once it comes forward, it's going to strike the back end of the firing pin. And it's this blow that drives the firing pin forward into the primer. So this is acting like a hammer on a hammer-fired action, coming in and striking the firing pin. Very unlike the other open bolt actions we've seen so far. So very unique and interesting design. I discussed earlier in the video that the program I use would cause me some issues in demonstrating some of the functionality of these firearms. And one limitation it has with certain firearms is that certain elements of the function of that firearm are not very well animated, or the animations are missing, or the timing of those animations are off to what they would be in the true functionality of the firearm. And the trigger group actually has a couple different issues. The first issue is the fact that the pulling of the trigger is not animated at all. No matter how much I slow down the program, when I press the fire button, it just jumps straight from the trigger being in its forward position to its fully rearmost position, having been fully pulled. There's just no animation in between that. So unfortunately, I can't show you what happens as the trigger is pulled. Instead, I'm just going to have to describe it to you. Another issue we'll get into a little bit later is the fact that the timing of some of the movement of the parts is incorrect, chiefly out of laziness, so that the animations of the operation of the firearm would fit more easily together during fully automatic fire. And because the current animation loop I have is only a single shot, the timing is going to be off. In any case, let's go ahead and discuss what happens when the trigger is pulled. So as the trigger is pulled, the trigger is going to pivot. And as it pivots, it's going to bring this piece here connected to the trigger up. And as this piece moves upward, it's going to contact this piece here. And that is going to force this arm here to pivot downwards. And we can see on the other side, here's the arm pivoted downwards. Now, the importance of this arm is not that it acts upon the sear. It actually doesn't. Instead, what it does is it fits in between the sear and blocks contact with this plunger here. And if we zoom out here, we can see this plunger is spring-loaded. Well, what happens when this piece breaks contact with this plunger as it pivots down is it allows the plunger to act upon the sear. Now, currently, the sear is pushed down, and it is not actually in contact with the bolt carrier. The bolt carrier just hasn't started moving forward yet. What happens is this plunger pushes forward and acts upon the sear, and because of this slope, pushes it downwards. As the plunger moves in, it pushes down on the sear. And once the sear breaks contact with the bolt carrier is free to move forward. Now, I've zoomed out quite a bit here so that we can get full view of the spring-loaded plunger, as its functionality is important to the operation of the trigger group itself. So as the bolt comes forward, it's going to do its thing, and then it's going to come to the rear. Now, as it comes to the rear, the bolt carrier is going to force the plunger backwards. And as it does so, the sear can move back up because the plunger is no longer acting upon it. And at this point, the sear will grab the bolt carrier as it comes forward. Even if we just held the trigger once and then let it go, this would still occur. Because remember, the trigger does not actually act upon the sear. It only allows the plunger to act upon the sear. Now, when the bolt carrier strikes the plunger punches this piece here, which is going to act upon this spring. So the spring that acts upon the plunger does so indirectly due to the contact of this part. And once the bolt carrier punches the plunger backwards, this piece is going to be forced down. And once that momentum is overcome by the tension of its spring, it's going to start to force this piece back forward. And then eventually it's going to contact the plunger and force the plunger forward again. Now you can see in this animation the sear being driven down, as it normally would be if we continued to hold the trigger in, as we have done. But because this animation loop contains the animation for just a single shot, we're going to see some frankly, incorrect timing happen. So what we're going to see happen is the trigger get let out, which is going to cause this piece here to start to move up. Now you might see the sear coming up. This normally would not happen as you're letting out the trigger, as the trigger does not act upon the sear. What actually is happening is this piece in the middle is starting to push back on the plunger, removing its contact from the sear. As you can see, with this piece, with the trigger let out and this piece allowed to be in its uppermost position, it's preventing the direct contact of the plunger with the sear. And again, it's this plunger that forces the sear down. So why is this animation incorrect? Because if we had not let out the trigger, what would have happened? As this piece comes back forward to strike the plunger, is the plunger would have acted upon the sear as we see animated. And once the sear would drop like this, what's keeping the bolt carrier from moving forward? Nothing. It would move forward. So it's this plunger that is responsible for the automatic fire. As it acts upon the sear again, the bolt carrier is allowed to move forward again because the sear is tripped. As long as we keep the trigger held in, that would continue. If we let out the trigger before the plunger struck the sear, this piece here, this arm, would prevent that contact of the plunger and the firearm would stop firing. The bolt carrier would not move forward because the sear would not let it go. But this animation is incorrect because it shows the timing wrong. It shows this piece coming up after the fact, which would not prevent the sear from tripping the bolt. So if this animation were to be correct, technically the bolt would have gone forward again, then come back, and this piece being in the way of the plunger, the sear would not have tripped. That would have been the correct animation, but they didn't do it that way. And the reason they didn't do it that way, we'll demonstrate in a little bit here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to end the current animation loop and start a new one. But in this new animation loop, I'm going to keep the trigger held down. And watch what happens with the animation and how it differs. So as I keep the trigger held down, we see the bolt cycling as it normally would. And honestly, this is probably a little too slow. We see the plunger come up, act, and then the bolt comes forward. So now the animation is correct because the plunger is what is tripping the sear as it normally would be. So how is this any different than the animation loop that I showed you before? It isn't. All they have done to change the animation loop for the last shot in a cycle, if I let go of the trigger now, it just append a little bit of an animation with the trigger resetting. Even though that animation is entirely incorrect. It makes it a lot easier, though, to loop the animations together because all you have to do is just trim off that little bit at the end to get a correct, fully automatic cycle. With all that being said, let's go ahead and fire this thing in full auto, which is the only way that this firearm fires, honestly, and empty out a full magazine. Now, I've sped things up quite a bit so that it's only half speed. And there we see one element of the function of an open bolt firearm, in that when you have fired off the last shot, the bolt's going to still come back and then forward again, but because you're not feeding in another cartridge and firing that off, there's no recoil energy to send the bolt back again, so it will stop in the forward position, which is actually technically the opposite of what you often see in a closed bolt action, where the bolt would be locked back on the last shot. Now, there is an actual mechanism in a closed bolt firearm to get it to do that, as that's not naturally what it would do. But with an open bolt firearm, it will do that regardless. It will come forward like this. So when you go to reload, you're going to have to bring the bolt back and then insert a fresh magazine before you can fire again. Now let's talk about The strengths and weaknesses of the open bolt action. Starting off with the strengths, as we saw with the Sten in the first example, an open bolt design can be super simple. As the bolt delivers the energy to ignite the primer of the cartridge, a hammer that strikes a firing pin or a striker that moves inside the bolt is no longer required. This means less moving parts and less machining processes to manufacture an open bolt firearm, keeping costs low. The simplest open bolt firearms are so simple, it is something you can realistically make yourself with a little bit of tool handling skill, the proper tools, and a trip to the local hardware store for most of the parts. This is why I have seen a few books with titles something like, How to Build a Submachine Gun in the Comfort of Your Own Home. The main obstacle of building an open bolt firearm yourself is building a magazine, which if you design the firearm to accept already existing magazines, you can circumvent that issue. And rifling a barrel, which is why all of the books I have seen on the subject have you building a smoothbore firearm. The problem with a smoothbore barrel is that the modern factory-produced ammunition you would use is not designed to be fired through a barrel without rifling and would be horribly inaccurate. Another strength, especially for military purposes, is the fact that an open bolt firearm is less likely to cook off a round after continuous firing has made the gun very hot, as it keeps the action open, thus allowing for better heat dissipation, and does not hold a round in the chamber like a closed bolt action would. Another possible strength, depending on how you look at it, is the fact that the trigger group is naturally inclined to fire fully automatic, with the trigger having to be specifically designed to allow for semi-automatic fire, which is the exact opposite thing you find in a closed bolt action, which is inclined to fire in semi-automatic mode. Moving on to the weaknesses, which are many-fold, chief among which is the delay that occurs between the pulling of the trigger and the actual firing of the cartridge. All the time it takes for the bolt to travel forward, feed around in the chamber, and then fire the cartridge is time that you as the shooter have to hold the firearm on target, making accuracy difficult when being fired one shot at a time. Firing in fully automatic can overcome this inaccuracy to a degree by allowing the shooter to walk the fire on target, but this downside is what prevented hunting arms, for instance, ever adopting an open bolt design with any amount of success. A potential concern is the fact that all that holds the bolt back in many open bolt designs is its contact with the sear, potentially being a safety hazard if the contact was inadvertently broken by the firearm being jarred by a sharp impact, for instance, if the firearm was dropped. Another weakness is the fact that the open action of an open bolt design is vulnerable to the ingress of dirt and other various substances you do not want in the action, requiring special care to be taken and possibly requiring the action to be carried closed and not bringing the bolt back until the firearm is ready to be fired, both to prevent dirt from getting in, but also as a safer way to carry the firearm if there is no round in the chamber. Unfortunately, as interesting as open bolt firearms are, it is not something many of us in the United States will likely ever encounter, at least not someone of my age or younger. In any case, I hope you have enjoyed the video and found it informative. This is Mouse Gunner, signing out.